Okay. Okay, you're being recorded now, especially you guys out on Zoom. Oh, I got it on mine too. In DC, housing was often just an amazing mix of people, more so than other cities, apparently, where rich and poor, black and white, all sorts of people lived just cheek by jowl. Partly this was the result of a lot of people living in the alleyways. So you could have wealthy people on the street and very unwealthy people living in the alleyways behind. But even beyond that, it was just a mix. And predictably, I guess, some of the better off people were unhappy with this. So people tried experiments with LaDroit Park, which, as I say, bombed. So still, this was a desirable idea. And in the 1880s, three guys came up with a scheme to make an exclusive neighborhood where they could do this kind of marketing. And the big advantage of it was it would stay exclusive. They were known as the California Syndicate. You can go back and pull up stories about the California Syndicate. They seem to have gotten their money from Senator Sharon, who was a senator from Nevada who made big bucks in silver mining. And they were buying up properties. And here's the Evening Star reporting on them. They buy a farm and negotiating for other property. They're making purchases along the line of Connecticut Avenue extended. Extended, it says, because Connecticut Avenue didn't come out past like Florida Avenue, but if you drew a straight line, they were buying property in a straight line. And then at this point, a guy named Mr. Bell, it's spelled Beal, but it was evidently pronounced Bell, purchased two large farms in the vicinity. One is 125 acres, partly in Montgomery County, and it's next to another farm called Chevy Chase, which is owned by John C. Bullitt. Earlier, during 2 decades earlier, the farm had been owned by a Mr. Bradley, a very colorful attorney, and we're talking about the property across the street. So in 1890, the syndicate incorporated and kind of went public because they owned their land. What was the name of the syndicate? Yes, I hear several answers there. Okay, we're getting up into, oh, Chevy Chase Land Company. Thank you, Sarah. So let's take a look at their property holdings. This is their property as of 1994. It's a little later. Connecticut Avenue exists in this. What we have in the center, here's the zoo, okay? What I've done from this 1894 map is highlighted all the spots where Chevy Chase Land Company bought land in this straight line out, and we're just gonna follow it out. Here you go, up past Tenley Town, yeah, all the way to, look at that, all the way, a direct line to Chevy Chase and a direct line to the Maryland state line. And you know, the funny thing about this is, look, all the buildings on the Maryland side of this line, they're not, even though they own this land and it's perfectly good, I lived there for nearly 20 years, they don't build until they hit Maryland. So why why wait to get to Maryland? I mean, they could have put Chevy Chase like where Cleveland Park was. They're building this trolley, it would have saved money, less of a commute for the first buyers and stuff. Well, there were some big differences between DC and Maryland at the time. In Maryland, nobody was going to be tearing down a wall. For those who don't know my background, around 2015, I started working on a project on Montgomery County's lynchings. There were 3 lynchings in Montgomery County, if you're not familiar with them. And we're now right in between the first 2 and the third one. Here's another New York Times clipping. Yeah. It took a turn to avoid the, oh yeah, did Connecticut stop at the Maryland DC line? As they built it, it took a turn probably to avoid cutting through the Bradley farm, which the Chevy Chase Land Company, I believe, originally leased from Mr. Bullitt for a hunt club. Okay. Anyway, this was the second of the three lynchings. A brutal Negro lynch on the front page of the New York Times. I have to stop. This is should be about July 5th in no, not July 5th, earlier in 1880. I'm sorry, I don't have the date. Yeah, it's July 1880. So this is 10 years earlier than the development. There was a third one that was going to take 6 years after the land company was formed. I have to say of this headline, "A Brutal Negro Lynched," it had nothing to do with journalism. The New York Times used that identical headline 11 times. It had nothing to do with anything other than they're slapping their standard headline on the incident as a way to justify the lynching. Yeah, and the New York Times has never really apologized for this. Anyway, sorry to get off on that. The head of the California syndicate is this gentleman, Francis Newlands. He wasn't a senator to begin with. Afterwards, he became a representative, and he did eventually become a senator. But his real claim to fame, and the reason he's the guy behind it, was he was Senator Sharon's son-in-law. The silver money went to him, and he and his friends could afford to do something like that. He was the founder of the land company. He was the first president of what was originally the Hunt Club across the street. He was the public face of the whole thing, and until pretty recently was quite honored around here. It turns out that Senator Newlands had very strong ideas on the subject of race in immigration, which he wasn't shy about. Yeah, I mean, if you start researching it, there's like a wealth of material. And forgive me, I have access to the New York Times database, so it's really helpful to use them. This is from, I think, 1912. It's the walk up to the Democratic presidential convention and race issue plank for the Democrats. The party convention that year was in Baltimore. Senator Newlands of Nevada arrives in Baltimore with one he will urge, would disenfranchise Negro. He wants to take the vote away from Black people. And let me see, do I have I can't read the quotes here really well, but do I have it in here? Let's see. The senator calls it his white plank. In a few words, it proposes a constitutional amendment which will disenfranchise the Negro and bar the yellow races from entry to the country except for temporary purposes. Right, yeah, he's talking about Asia. His big brilliant idea, his big idea was that he would take the xenophobia of the West Coast, anti-Japanese, anti-China, and merge it with the racism that he saw in the South and end up with a result that could give the Democrats the presidency. So that's what this is about. But he wasn't just about that. A few years later, you can see him in the congressional record saying, it is time to write into the Constitution that this is a white man's country. And he expressed that view multiple times. Oh, and I forget, he has at least one connection or two that we know of, thanks to our archivist, when All Saints was built as the church of Chevy Chase. Senator Newlands worked with St. John's for us to sponsor the church. And Kathy actually found to him in the, do I have it here? In our minutes of 1900. On motion of Mr. Pickle, a committee of three, this is our vestry notes, a committee of three was appointed to prepare a note of thanks and to be eminently engrossed, I don't know, maybe engraved, to be presented to the Honorable Mr. Newlands for his munificent gift. We're not sure what the gift was, but it might have been the land for Chevy Chase. Anyway, so this is the founder, the lead founder, I should say. And so how do you keep a suburb so that only the right sort of people come in? And at this time, we should be clear, the wrong sort of people would have included Italians, Catholics, Anybody from the Middle East, anywhere in the Middle East, yes, absolutely Jews, and we'll get to that, yes. So this is how they advertise it. Thomas J. Fisher was the real estate arm, and there's also a bank arm that worked with the Chevy Chase Land Company. This is pretty well known. They're advertising the neighborhood, our neighborhood. The only restrictions imposed are those which experience has proven are necessary in any residential section to maintain or increase values and protect property holders against the encroachment of undesirable elements. So let's get into this. Well, let me hang on. The specifics of those elements originally there were covenants. They were not racial covenants, but they set minimum prices on the housing. So the most desirable were the houses facing Connecticut Avenue, and the minimum price for those was going to be $5,000. If you lived off of Connecticut Avenue, you got a price break of a couple thousand. And later on, our neighborhood here, this is the Thomas Haight subdivision, the minimum price was only $2,500. So actually St. John's is a little bit in the low rent district. So is the goal here to keep poor people out? You know, maybe they just wanted to keep out poor people. Well, we actually had a test of that in 1906. Here's an ad. There was a new development. Let me see. So there was a new development, another syndicate of 4 people formed to build the development out here. They actually hired a straw man to buy the land for them from the Chevy Chase Land Company. The straw man was white, but the 4 affluent people who were starting the suburb were Black. 3 of the 4 had advanced degrees from Howard. They didn't think they could buy directly from the Chevy Chase Land Company, so they got somebody else to do it for them. They got the land and they started marketing it. Mr. Satterwhite was one of them. Come out today and tomorrow, 42 lots sold in beautiful Belmont. Where is Belmont? Y'all know Saks Avenue? Saks Avenue down there, and that parking lot is in the middle of what would have been Belmont if these folks had been successful. And they say the only high-class subdivision in Washington where colored people can buy. That's because there were perfectly affluent African Americans in DC at the time. There had been since before the Civil War. There's this great history of entrepreneurship. They could have afforded to buy just fine or start their own subdivision if they'd been allowed. So how did this go over? Well, not well. Belmont issue stirs realty world. Armed neutrality exists between Belmont factions on the Rockville Road. Here's a quote from a neighbor. A leading citizen of Friendship Heights has announced that the establishment of a settlement for colored persons in his immediate neighborhood would mean, we gotta hit this list, immediate would mean an impairment of the value of his property and the destruction of the peace and security of his family and the happiness of his home. Damn, I mean, that's a lot to put on there. I have to say, since reading this, anytime somebody, not just this, but researching this for some years, anytime somebody starts talking about maintaining property values now, I have a bad reaction because it's often code for other things. Yeah, I won't go off on that tangent. Okay, here again is the New York Times coverage. A syndicate of real estate operators holding Belmont Park, adjoining Chevy Chase, and other pretty suburban colonies have offered to sell to a syndicate of colored capitalists who desire to build up a distinctly Negro suburb. If you read all the way down to the bottom of this, it is proposed that if the Negro movement goes any further to result to mob violence to keep the colored householders out. I mean, you could take that as a blowhard. This is like 10 years almost to the day since a guy named Sidney Randolph was lynched in Rockville with no repercussions for anybody. They're not joking around here. I mean, would you feel comfortable buying in Belmont after seeing something like that in the paper? What happened to Belmont? The Somerset town marshal arrested Mr. Satterwhite, charged him with selling real estate without a license. The judge acquitted him, said, you have a right to sell what you own, and he owned it. The town marshal busted him again and charged him with doing business on the Sabbath. And he was acquitted that time. And what we find from this is that the Somerset had a town marshal, and evidently he was a Pharisee, enforcing Sabbath rules. Okay, so let's move on a bit. Everybody's heard of the covenants, and by starting, I think, 1906 in Montgomery County, certainly 1910s, 1920s, they were moving to the famous racial covenants. Okay, so I should have marked it some other way. Right here near the bottom arrowhead, here's St. John's. This is off a wonderful study that our county has done of what parts of the county were covered by racial covenants. It's an online map. I'm going to give a link to it in a minute. You can check your own subdivision and see what the history was. This gives an idea. Here's section 8, Chevy Chase. That's like a couple blocks that way. Said land shall never be rented, well, your words, in trust or occupied by any Negro or colored person or any person of Negro extraction. Here is like right across the street, sort of where the fire station is today. Again, not in trust or occupied by any Negro or colored person or any person of Negro extraction. These and this is 1915, 1928, these covenants are pretty bland as they go. If you read ones from other neighborhoods and further out, they go after any person of the Semitic race, and having evidently no idea of geography, they go from Armenia to, I don't know, Iran. They're just trying to keep out Jews, with the practice that continues into the 1960s, but these just bizarre things that are attached to the properties. Here's, I think, maybe if you want to look up your own home, and I can call this up later, bit.ly MoCo racial covenants, and you can pull up the map and click on your house and see what it was. It won't tell you for your specific house, because that varies a little. It tells for the neighborhood development, which is where the covenants were initially set. So what's going on? What's the motivation for this? Why are people fleeing to the suburbs and doing this stuff? What is the problem with white people, right? Still a question. In the 1920s, a Howard sociologist tried to answer this question. He published a book, and he did a survey, and he asked white people, what is the problem? This is his table from the book. Summary of attitudes of whites, and he asked several hundred white people, what's the problem? Why don't you want black folks for your neighbors? And he got all kinds of stuff. Some of this is hard to, some of it I'm just not going to read. And it can be hard to read. Here's only a couple people, fear of white daughter falling in love with Negroes. How about very popular, Negroes too gregarious? Yeah, we white people do not like gregarious neighbors. They should just stay in their houses and not bother us. But the number one, I mean, I make it fun, anyway, the number one reason here, probably and elsewhere, was what will my friends think? In other words, it's pursuit of status and maintenance of status. As William Henry Jones, here's the professor over here, his book, he did 2 books, has a nice picture of him. He said, this was found to be the chief factor appearing in a greater or lesser degree in every case. The statement of one white woman is significant, Who wants his friends to drive by and see him sitting on the porch with Negroes on the porch next door? Not me. This is, you know, the best information I have on what the issue was. It was status. Yes, Earl. Right, Earl for. So Earl's just made the point. Fear of growing to like Negroes was put up there, and we certainly don't want to grow to like other people, right? You wonder what we were learning about in church, and at this time, a lot of people went to church, including this one. But yes, thank you, Earl. This table is pretty classic. Okay. Oh yes. Well, that was one of them. You saw fear of white daughter falling in love. Oh, love. You know, it's interesting. Nobody's worried about their sons. But I mean, very liberal of them. Okay. Some people have referred to this as the redlining talk, and I'm going to hit that for just a second. I think most folks know what redlining was. The federal government mapped out most cities and refused to work to block lending in predominantly minority areas, and this practice spread to other services like banking and food and so on. It'd be wrong to call this the redlining talk, because there were not a lot of banks refusing to lend in Chevy Chase. It was important in Montgomery County. The staff of, I think the planning board went and looked at 411 mortgages written at that time, and 400 of them to white people, 9 were to black people, and 2 they couldn't tell. And this is reflected nationally. So it does shape our county. It was not keeping people from buying houses here or in Belmont, what would have been Belmont if, oh, I forgot to finish the Belmont story. They went into litigation. Chevy Chase Land Company explicitly complained that they said they were trying to sell to black people. 20 years in litigation, and it finally was just reabsorbed. And now you can go park at Saks in a parking space that might have been a home in Belmont. Oh yeah, if I hadn't said Belmont is, just go down Wisconsin Avenue on the left, Saks Fifth Avenue sits squarely in the middle of it, on down to that shopping center. Yes? Oh, wow, there's a plaque now. Okay, so there is Belmont Avenue now, I'm hearing. And thank you so much. I didn't know there's a plaque. And you can. Oh, somebody's put up a discreet sign. Okay. We don't want to be accused of being gregarious. Um, so these covenants, especially if you look at the map, are a really nice marker. But what happened to covenants? In 1948, the Supreme Court had earlier upheld them. And let me say, they got really bizarre in Montgomery County. There's a famous case where a neighborhood sued a woman as a family. They sued the wife, trying to get her to evict her husband because he was Jewish. I think this is the 1940s. Can you imagine? And they had kids, and they want the husband evicted. And it only died because it became widely publicized, and they decided they were embarrassing themselves. As far as I can tell. 1948, the Supreme Court ruled did not strike down covenants. They said they were unenforceable in court. They didn't wipe them off the books or anything. You just couldn't sue. You couldn't sue the lady for having a Jewish husband, basically, but they were still there. So what impact did that have on real estate? Remember, it's 1948. We're going to make covenants pointless, so they'll stay on the books. Okay, this is from 12 years before that. This shows in a practical way how the discrimination was enforced. As I keep going to Chevy Chase, you know, the neighborhoods are expanding outwards, right? we're doing Chevy Chase because we're here. If we're in Silver Spring, we could start there. The neighborhoods are expanding outward. Here's a place, a subdivision just up the street from us. And they say that Overbrook, a restricted subdivision. This is the key word telling you got to be white and probably not Catholic, not Jewish, to show up and buy there. So what happens once the covenants? Oh, there's a. What happens when the covenants are sort of struck down? Okay, this is an ad from 1952, 4 years after that happens. The Hamlet, Washington's most distinctive suburb. Some of us may live there. This is like Chevy Chase north of East-West Highway on the east side a little bit. Nice neighborhood. Washington's most distinctive suburb, a highly restricted subdivision in Chevy Chase. Restricted has the same meaning here. It's not enforced by covenants, but the developer can refuse to sell. Owners can refuse to sell and are pressured to refuse to sell. Realtors are under really a restriction that keeps them from breaking the racial integrity of a white neighborhood. And I should also, I've neglected to say, these covenants and these ads, this is not because some ex-Confederate developer particularly wants to keep Black people out of the Washington suburbs. This is an amenity like having a 2-car garage or a really nice kitchen. It is a way of selling real estate to do this kind of stuff. The truth is that a lot of realtors, or some realtors, were also perfectly happy to sell to African Americans and to charge them more to slide them into these places. So it's not, this is a commercial proposition. It's a way to sell these houses. Yeah, Nancy. You mean as far as being Jewish? Nancy's asking, or Catholic. Right, yeah, right. Yeah, I will. So Nancy's saying, was there like a form that said your religion as far as Jewish and Catholic? No, they had to guess based on last name and stuff. With Catholics, the question was how many kids did they have? And did open up. You can go into the Chevy Chase Historic Archives and read an account of the first Italian family allowed to buy a house in Chevy Chase and how perfectly normal they were. The person giving the account talks of going over and they were just like everybody else. And yes, of course, Maryland is Catholic in its founding, but at this time, it's WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. All right. So this shows how it continues. Here's the end result of this. In the 1950s, a Black clergyman testifying about what was going on said a white collar had developed around Washington by what was really some of the first white flight in the nation. So look at the population of Montgomery County in 1890. It is about over 1/3 Black. And part of these are descended from slaves who were here, from enslaved people, and part were free people who were free from well before the Civil War. Here's the population in 1960. The absolute population of African Americans has gone up from 9,600 to 11,000. The white population has ballooned from 17,000 to 327,000. It's not because African Americans were not trying to buy here, because they were not allowed to buy here. And we're going to, just a second, if I can remember what my next slide is, we're going to see how that continued, into the 1960s, which I realize for some people is still ancient history. I might as well be talking about the 1890s. But for me, the 1960s are pretty recent. So this is one case, one well-known case. Yes, sir, Earl. Through it today? Yeah, so today, Montgomery County is 40% non-Hispanic white. just 40%. But you wouldn't know that. I mean, if I polled people, hang on, I'll get that question. Earl had asked what the deal is today. If you walk around, say if you walk from here to the Apple store, you might not realize that that demographic change has happened. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So for the Zoom people, someone's just pointed out that this slide that for certain parts of our county, and we're talking largely around here, though John Talbert's going to discuss this in more detail next week, right? Our local demographics, but for actually the lives of a lot of people who attend St. John's, life still looks like this. And it's been more than 50 years since discrimination has been outlawed. Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. They would flip neighborhoods. So parishioner who works for Fannie Mae is talking about blockbusting, which certainly went on in Northeast Washington and helped contribute at times a lot to this fight. It was a thing where what was then considered a dishonest realtor would go in, arrange for an African American family that was looking for a good house in a good neighborhood to buy in a neighborhood, and then the vultures would come in and get all the neighbors to all the white neighbors to sell out. Say, you better sell quickly because your neighborhood is going downhill. I know even anecdotally, that this was still going on in the 1970s, maybe later, but I know somebody who had that experience where there were actually white neighbors going saying, don't let them do it. We're going to stay here. This is all right. Our neighborhood's going to be okay. And that did for part of this time. That was a big factor in this. Okay, so Roland Barnes. This gentleman has a doctorate in education from Columbia University, and his wife also had a degree. And he was hired by Montgomery County Public Schools in, I think, 1961, is it? He was hired to become the principal of Travilla Elementary School. Some things do change. If you had a doctorate, a guy with a doctorate from a prominent university being your principal, I would expect now the PTA or HSA to like chip in for them to buy a house, the way Montgomery County emphasizes education. But at this time, so he and his wife did not want to commute from DC, or I believe they owned a home, the killer commute. And so they went to, there's always new suburbs. They went and bought a house. Well, when the developer, or put down the deposit on a house, when the developer found out that a Black couple was buying his development, he ordered the deposit returned and canceled the sale and told them, no, we don't sell to Blacks. This is, I believe, 1961, was still going on. This also caused a case that made it up to the Supreme Court. But unfortunately, Dr. Barnes and his spouse moved to Pittsburgh, where they had a interesting and successful career. And to finish it off, I want to take the account of a lady who testified before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And I just want to read what she had to say. Call it up. I printed this out, but I didn't bring out the printout, so I'm going to have to read it from here. This is Mrs. Williams testifying. Mrs. Williams is an African-American lady, the wife of dentist, who moved to Montgomery County in the early 60s and had a great deal of difficulty doing that. Her husband was a dentist with a degree from Howard, and she was a school teacher. I believe she taught in Montgomery County, but she lived in DC, and it was an unpleasant commute for both of them, even back in 1960. So she told her story to this Commission on Civil Rights a couple years later. Let's see. My husband entered dental school, and I was hired by the Montgomery County Board of Education as a teacher. For 4 years, I traveled. Well, for 2 years, I traveled 66 miles a day. We lived in the district, and I taught in Montgomery County. When my husband graduated from dental school in '59, we moved to Montgomery County. He opened an office in Rockville, and we started looking for a house and had a great deal of difficulty finding a house. Our first experience was with a house in Norbeck, Maryland. This house was advertised in the paper, and we knew that on this particular road, there were Negroes living, and we felt that we probably had a good chance of getting this house. Something I haven't covered was Montgomery County's had more than 40 like African-American hamlets scattered around the county, including I live near one, there's one near Huron River Road. I've heard from the residents, a lot of them, and they were really good places to grow up. It's very interesting. But we're sticking with the other side of that. Anyway, we talked to the real estate agent over the phone, and she quoted the price as it was stated in the newspaper. When she saw my husband was a Negro, the price went up $1,000. We asked her about this, and she said there'd been a mistake in the newspaper. We had a white friend inquire about the same house. She was the realtor discouraged her because they felt they had a Negro buyer, and there was a good chance of getting $1,000 more. And the agent said to my friend, well, you don't really want this house, do you? So we made a down payment on this house with a stipulation that we would only pay the advertised price for the house. And finally, we had to get our money back because they were pretty sure they'd be able to sell it. Since there was a Negro family interested, they could get $1,000 more. We did not buy this particular house. Things get worse. In March of '61, I called the Suburban Real Estate Agency and told them I would like to see the house that we have since bought where they were living. This is out Connecticut Avenue in Kensington. The agent said he'd like for me to come to the office first. Well, I said that I would rather not, because I knew once he had a chance to see me ahead of time, I would never have the opportunity to see the house. I told him it would be very inconvenient for me to meet him at the office, that I would prefer meeting him at the house. Well, we did this. I got to the house a little ahead of the agent, and I went in. And when the agent came to the house, he seemed very surprised to see me. And when the owner introduced us, he said, you can look around if you want to. This is the agent. And he excused himself from the living room and went into the kitchen. He asked the owner whether or not she thought I was a Negro, and she gave him some ambiguous answer. He made no attempt to try to sell me the house or interest me in the house. I asked him the price of the house. He wasn't sure, but he gave me a price which was $1,000 higher than the asking price. When asked when the house would be available for occupancy, he didn't know. He had absolutely no information about the house he was showing to me. After she looked at it, and she said she would like to buy it, and I wanted to sign the contract that day. He said I could not sign the contract, and I asked him why, and he says, well, I'll have to get in touch with you. And I asked when he would do this. He said, in a couple days. So this goes on. She calls him and stuff, and he says, oh, the down payment was a lot bigger than what you expected, and says, can you handle this? And I said, yes, this would be no problem. And he said, do you plan to pay cash for your house? And I said, well, of course not. He said, well, you're going to have difficulty financing this house. And to this, I responded that I felt this would not be a problem for me. After he realized I could not be discouraged, he said, I understand you're married to Negro. And I said, yes, I was. He said, well, personally, I have no objection to you people, but, and explained that he had, I think, some 20 employees depending on him for a living. And if he should sell to me, he would be ruined and these people would be out of work, and he felt he had some responsibility to them. Now, he's not making this stuff up. The Realtors Code at the time prohibited him from messing with the neighborhood. We're running out of time. I'll just say, eventually she buys the house. And she says the neighbors are great. And the kids go over for overnights and stuff, but there is a noose left hanging outside the house. And there was a cross left burning against that. You see that little beam there? There was a cross burning in Montgomery County, and I think this is 1961. And the police felt no particular need to do anything about it. Yeah, the story, her whole story is worth reading. I'm sorry, I can't just sit here and read the whole thing. So I think we'll stop there. I'm sorry if I've gone long. Y'all have already had some good questions. You know, I'd ask you to think about your neighborhoods today. And what does it look like? As I say, John's going to be discussing that some next week. But I hope this gives you some background on how things came to be the way they are around here. Yeah, sir.
You have a question? About 5 minutes for questions? Yeah.
Questions.
Yeah, short.
That'd be great. Okay. Here we go. Come on up, folks. A little weird, but it'll work.
So
Nancy.
was Garrett Park one of those areas that was focused for blacks, for wealthy blacks? Do you know? Because I know they still have, because I think that's one where it's an area that still is heavily, you know, more affluent black, and it was kind of, I thought it was designed that way. So
You know, I don't know the history of Garrett Park. It's not,
it's
I
sort
don't
of
know it
northern.
as one of the major hamlets around like Lincoln Park or Linden or Gibson Grove and stuff. I'm sure it has an interesting history, as do a lot of our neighborhoods, and I hope people check into it.
I know people who are living in Kensington now, who their neighborhood has realized that they have these covenants that blacks couldn't go into their swimming pools or public pools.
Oh,
and
yeah,
things
of
like that.
course.
Kids couldn't, you know, so there were all sorts of other kinds of fallouts of this, so.
Yep. Yes, and I don't have to repeat. Anybody else got a comment or a question, or what do y'all think of this in terms of where you live now? Yeah, come on up.
We're running out of time, but
We got
just
time.
some detail. The east-west connection, Newlands,
Yeah.
is interesting, I think, and it does put some perspective in terms of just sort of the black focus here.
Mhm.
So a couple of these streets here are named after West Coast figure Leland Stanford. There's Leland Street here, there's Stanford Street. That's because Newlands is part of that California.
Oh, the California Syndicate.
Group. And you know, Newlands, and they also developed South San Francisco area, the Burlingame. But you know, there it's very much an Asian
Yeah.
thing. So there's a lot of broader white nationalism. It's a broader, and the Catholic thing is important. You know, these people were they were not narrow in their bigotry.
Right, absolutely. And this in that earlier clip, this is what Senator Newlands was trying to harvest. He was more than 100 years early, I guess. Very insightful that you could bring various kinds of bigotry together.
The Chevy Chase Club did not allow Catholics. That's why we have
Yeah,
Columbia was
right.
originally a Catholic institution.
Yeah. Okay, I hope this has been helpful.
As Jay already mentioned, he set up things beautifully for the next forum, next Sunday, which is Reverend John Talbert, who's going to talk about what the demographics are today in our neighborhood in particular. Who is our neighbor and what does that entail? A theological discussion. So we're all looking forward to that. Just to remind you, we've got some a couple of other wonderful things coming up in October, not the least of which is our very first town hall, which will be on October the 22nd, on the looking at the roots of food insecurity with a great panel discussion. It's going to be led by our Deacon Ann Dursey back there, and has some wonderful people on it. John Ross, of course, and many others, especially in county government. For families, especially with kids, we invite you all to participate in our first movie night on Friday the 27th, where we're going to be screening Coco for the kids, introducing them to the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, and we have a wonderful opportunity that evening to introduce them to some the right kind of food that they have for that celebration. And then that will be followed very quickly the next Sunday after that by a forum that will be focusing on Halloween, Day of the Dead, All Saints, All Souls. What is the difference? What is the similarity? How are these things celebrated in different cultures? And we'll have a real big emphasis on the Day of the Dead that day, because after we talk about the differences and similarities between those holidays, we're going to have some wonderful workshops. We're going to have workshops in face painting, skeletal in face painting, and we'll have some pan de los muertos, the special Day of the Dead bread. We'll have some other wonderful goodies. We'll have flower making, that wonderful flower making, and some other great emphasis on how this is celebrated. It is a day of celebration in Mexico, and honoring not only honoring your dead, but you know, there's actually altars that are set up called ofrenda, right? And we will have one set up that day. If you have pictures of your loved ones that you wish to remember, please bring them, because we can put them into that ofrenda. And so we hope that this sort of kicks off maybe an annual celebration of that wonderful celebration here at St. John's. And actually, Chris is going to bring for the movie night, is going to bring his 2 dogs, which are the special dogs. The name?
I'll let you pronounce it.
I can't.
Mexican hairless. Technically, the name is George Quincy.
Yeah, you try that, okay? And but they're going to come because that's the dog that's in the movie Coco. For those of you who've seen Coco, and so he's going to bring them to the delight of the children. So lots of wonderful things planned for the rest of October. Before we even get to November, and one thing I will say, if you pick up the schedule here and a button, they're available up here. In November, the Gay Men's Chorus has been actually confirmed completely for November the 18th, and 2 of their very famous ensembles are going to be performing that evening. So we'll be hearing more about that later. But thank you so much for coming. Yeah.